Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Vampires exist. They exist in very few numbers around the world. They don't appear to have any organized society and operate like nomadic serial killers. Either there's not enough of them, or they just prefer to isolate themselves, but they don't seem to group up into vampire covens and are just individuals or maybe a pair. There's a record of a group of 4 or 5 of them operating like a family unit during the 70s, though. The condition appears to be spread through bite or direct blood-to-blood contact. Even though it's spread through fluids, no test done on their blood can determine any actual viral or bacterial presence that causes vampires. So it is unknown how the process turns human into vampire, and finding out that information entails infecting a live human with the subject's fluids, and that's something we won't exactly do. Can't speak for any other entities that are aware of their existence. We do not know or have any information on what causes the phenomena. Our knowledge on their reproduction is theory at best, and purely based on 2 factors: the anecdote provided by the single one that was captured, and evidence from killings committed possibly by vampires at large. While they take steps to dispose of evidence of their homicides, any recovered remains that have evidence of being bitten have also been dismembered, with the spinal region almost always severed. This slightly contradicts with some information learned by tests on the subject in captivity. Severing the spinal region or even complete decapitation does not cause death, nor will death later result from destruction of the central nervous system. I'll continue in another post. I'll tell you as much information on them I have, and I'll tell you how I got this information, and who gave it to me without telling too much. I'll go into their abilities and other attributes, and I know people will call this LARP. But if this phenomena ever becomes a big problem one day, you'll know. Anyways, decapitation leads to them being subdued at the most, and I'll go into how their bodies heal, but before I do, I'll tell you probably the most important part about them, right here. A human being that possesses the known attributes in order for them to be considered a vampire have one major biological difference, this being the presence of abnormal growth, like a tumor, of unknown origin that is located around the auricle of the left atrium and extends into the heart's right atrium and pulmonary artery. Its presence appears similar to a cardiac tumor of some sort. We cannot classify it as a malignant or benign growth. Upon further study, this growth appears to be a unique organ that appears to physiologically exert centralized control over the entire body. Evidence supporting this claim is that the organ is composed of cells that are almost genetically similar to the neuron cells in a human brain. Almost 99% match in DNA. And also, upon removal of the heart, along with this new organ, resulted in the complete medical death of the subject. And I will say this is the only way to kill them. Their bodies heal from almost any sort of conceivable damage done to it. It baffles any scientific explanation or doesn't resemble any sort of biological workings of any known organism. Going into more detail in my next post, there is technically a second way to kill them, and yes, it's the one you all expect. Their flesh reacts very violently to the sun's rays. Yes/X/. Sunlight kills vampires, and from the video evidence I've seen, in almost the same exact way popular media would lead us to believe it looked like. Now, to go into detail, we do not know what causes the initial input of high pressure and heat, which causes the outward forces resulting in the combustion, and as the rapid oxidation reaction that is the cause of what an explosion is, almost always results from building in pressure with materials like gas and has some fuel burning off this. The reaction of burning that occurs on vampires from sunlight seems to literally just come from nowhere. There are so many ways these things defy science and logic as we know of. I'll tell you all more in 10 or 15 minutes. I gotta put my annoying ass kid to sleep. Oh, BTW, it's not UV radiation or anything like that. A UV lamp has no effect on them. It seems to be only solar light rays that can cause that reaction. Only sunlight. Okay, guys. Anyways, I used to work at a federally funded R&D center in Central America that was funded by the U.S. to gather knowledge so the Department of Defense could formulate an adequate response to an outbreak scenario. This was a couple years ago, in 2013. The funding for the research was cut because we couldn't obtain enough viable evidence that vampires can turn humans by biting them. I personally believe that this is how vampires make new vampires. This was in Central America because we worked with local police forces compiling information on connected homicides that may possibly be connected and committed by individual or more vampires that are at large within the area. And along with tracking these supposed individual nomads, there was the presence of vampires within Mexican organized crime in southern Mexico. Now, we never got hard evidence that they are operating within Mexican crime groups, nor if it was a group of them or an individual. But there did seem to be knowledge amongst certain members of the cartels of them, and anecdotes provided matched other known info on them. We believe that there was a high possibility, I 100% believe it to be true, that vampires operated in some way or form within the cartel's activities. The Michoacana family and the Knights Templar cartel were those that had links to vampire activities, but my theory is that they work with the gangs because of the easy access to victims never to be seen again. Kidnappings are extremely common in Mexico. Cartel members would just ride up in trucks and fill them with kids they were taking away. Anyways, there's so much about them I could tell you, but IDK how to start exactly. Their abilities. Also like to add that the state police in Jalisco and Michoacana seem to know about vampires, and were super casual about it like it was nothing. They were legit, just like Seaway Chingazo Vampiro, and even arrest witches every now and then. They're really backwoods and don't seem to give AF about anything, but they were hella fun to drink and chill with. Going into their abilities. They appear to all be incredibly strong. We don't know if it's based on known science about physical muscle strength, or if it just seems to be magic. But when exerting force, their muscles in the body contract and move just like any regular person would. It's just the amount of that force seems to be far greater than what a human being could do. Now, when it comes to how the mass of their bodies correlate with how strong they are, it gets more complicated because regarding their bodies, their next ability I'll tell you about is basically magic, as in, we have no idea how they do it even upon close observation in a controlled environment with a live subject. Like they might as well be from a different dimension because they spit in the face of biology and known science on cell division. They can manipulate their bodies. To what degree is possible, we do not know. It's all almost the matter that makes up their bodies are malleable by sheer will. From what we've seen, shit like bones in their fingers sprouting to form claws, the calcium on their teeth can just basically flat out morph into more carnivore-like teeth. All of it becomes sharp, not just canines. And they can also increase the density of their bodies and harden their own skin like out of nowhere the extra mass comes on. When exposed to low light, their irises in their eyes seem to automatically form a reflective surface that resembles the eyes of animals. This actually an important factor because the changing of their eyes seems to be involuntary, while every other change can be done at will. My idea was the possibility of some sort of detection system involving their eyes. All of the changes that happen to their bodies, they can reserve it back to what it normally looked like. We've heard other insane shit like being able to fly with wings and cartel members claiming they can sprout swords from their arms. Now, we don't have any sort of evidence about their next claim, but we considered it a high possibility because of how many sources claimed it. We even have claims from the vampires themselves. The one in custody in Mexico and conversations recorded by an individual talking to two of them that were part of the family group in the 70s. They all claim to be able to live forever and don't get old. Claims from sources in Mexico claim this, with two people in the cartel claiming the vampire he saw looked just like a child. They all also don't know what causes their condition or abilities, or hinted at any sort of organization between several vampires. No underground rich society that we know of. And the one we had in custody appeared surprised when he learned of the existence of other vampires. The conversation from the one in the 70s indicated that one of the individuals, who acted as father of the family unit, claimed it happened because he was being punished for his sins. He claimed to have fought in the Mexican-American War and was a member of a military unit that scalped Indians and sold the scalps to the government. They were only supposed to be scalping a particular tribe, but ended up killing and scalping everyone they came across, and passing them off as the scalps of said tribe. He said because he was one of the few survivors of that unit, because they got scalped in revenge by natives. But being one of the survivors, he was selected to be cursed to walk the earth forever, and in his own words, live violently, implying that maybe they had some selection system on how they chose and turned humans. They all implied they were turned, with the 70s one claiming he turned 2 in the group, but the others they just met up with, and some of them claiming they were turned by accident. More than one mentioned a bite, with no other elaborate process mentioned. They aren't undead either, and their cardiovascular system still seems to be functioning. However, it appears to be on a much more slower and subdued scale. The one in custody, we noticed in particular, would sleep every morning. And this sleep wasn't like REM sleep in humans, though. He appeared to be in a deep stasis. It took a lot to wake him up, where the heart slows to 1 to 2 beats per minute. This wasn't involuntary, however, as if he was provided stimulation, us talking to him. He could stay awake. Though when given the option, like left to his own, he'd just enter that form of sleep naturally each time. And if undisturbed, we could wake him if he was slapped or shook violently. He would wake up at the same time every day, almost immediately when the sun set. Psychologically, they don't seem to be any different from humans that kill regularly and lack empathy. With how vampires are required to live, the ones that have already been doing their thing for a decade probably weren't the most empathetic of people in their human lives. It's like their existence weeds out those not willing to kill. They claim to have to kill their victims so their victims wouldn't turn, this also adding to the strong evidence that all it takes is a simple bite. Of course, all our funding would have continued, and the entire basis of the study was to find out if it could spread through simply a bite direct fluid contact. But they wanted like hardcore evidence, and not just everyone claiming so, including the vampires. But even under an electron microscope, vampires' blood has no notable differences from human blood, other than being less oxygenated. So the test of placing 2 samples of blood together, human and vampire, wouldn't do shit, just mix blood. It was frustrating because it basically means that the only way we could get proof was to literally get a person turned and record the process. Most of us weren't willing to do that. We had volunteers, and there was no other way to prove it, so we got cut. And our team leader, who the Department of Defense talked to, directly claimed that we'd be allowed to and to find out any way possible. Basically, the American government doesn't care if we turn a human test subject into a vampire, with no known discernible way to reverse the process. The vampires themselves claim if they knew how to turn back, they'd have turned back by now. Only one actually claiming to enjoy it.
How can there be so few of them if it spreads so easily? All it would take is one careless asshole to start actively spreading it, and we'd see a whole lot of them popping up.
I agree, which is why the Department of Defense wanted us to conduct research with priority on how it's spread. Now I'm convinced that it's through simply a bite. Now we don't know enough to know how long the process takes, but me and some others personally believe that someone has to survive being attacked, bitten. Now, while their carelessness might come up in other ways, such as covering up their tracks, which is why I assume they operate in impoverished nations, but one thing I noticed most of them make sure of is that they fully kill their victims, unless they choose to turn someone, in the case of the 70s family group. They are very thorough about their kills, and most remains we find are dismembered, usually the heads or spinal regions, necks snapped. Now we don't know if the dismemberment is extra, or if that implies their victims' bodies can rise up from the dead, with everyone we've seen on them so far. Maybe that isn't so far-fetched, but that would be basically the final cherry on top. But I doubt it, as that would mean they could spread even far easier, as you'd have to make sure to completely eliminate any chances of them coming back. And their bodies are functionally alive with no sign of death decay, other than a significantly slowed cardiovascular system, which didn't impede their body actions in any way.
Makes enough sense, but I'm thinking more along the lines of one person actively trying to make more of them. Maybe careless was the wrong wording, but I feel like there would be at least one nihilistic guy somewhere along in history that would have tried to actively increase their numbers. And while we're at it, was there any reaction to religious symbolism in your research? Crosses, holy water, etc. If not, maybe our edgelord friend can shed some light on that situation.
So basically what you're saying is that vampires have a brain tumor growing on their heart, and that's their only weakness? Sounds out there, but if it's true, I guess that explains the whole wooden stake through the heart.
It appears to be tumorous in appearance, but might be something else entirely. I don't know what it is, but if we think it might essentially be their new brain, so to speak, considering that removing it ceases all life activity. They seem to be very hard to kill, though. The one captive at the research center was already there when I arrived. I heard in just subduing it a single vampire. 7 Mexican cops and soldiers were killed, and if I recall correctly, 14 were injured. They didn't even take him to the station. They kept it pinned against the front of a house with a Humvee for a few hours until bringing it to the center. The vampires seemed to be partly religious themselves and owned religious symbols or didn't care. I'd like to add that the police captain told me that wasn't even the first time he'd seen one. The last being in '94 or '93, he said, which also engaged police forces. It's ridiculous how they pass this off as normal. It's making me think maybe we should look into their witches, because they brought that up a lot. Also, I should mention that the vampire was initially armed with a shotgun when they found him, so the death toll wasn't just him versus a whole police unit with his bare hands.
Low blood oxygen level. Do they breathe at all?
Yes, but not like us. His vitals were kept on constant monitor, and we noticed that he only started breathing regularly when there were other people in the room with him, or if he was speaking. If left on his own, his breathing grew oddly irregular, sometimes taking a couple breaths, and sometimes stopping for indefinite amounts of time. When he went to sleep in the morning, all respiratory functions ceased until he would wake. His cardiovascular functions were much slower, but we could measure resting for obvious reasons. His resting BPM was roughly 13 to 15 beats per minute, though when speaking enthusiastically, it could get up to 18, with 20 beats per minute being the highest. And while sleeping, his heart only beat once per minute. Their blood is much darker than a normal person's blood, almost black in color. Their lack of oxygenated blood doesn't seem to impede their normal functions, however, for reasons we couldn't figure out.
If vampires exist, would you want to hunt them down and kill them? If vampires exist the way you assert, then among their people, they hold great knowledge. Is a vampire a parasite on humanity, or a color much like a wolf? People killing people for the benefit of the herd, would a vampire choose to feed the good people, or the bad?
I mean, part of me wants to say yes, I think they should be hunted down and killed. But that might be because all of them that we have spoken to or have on record seem kind of like straight shitty people. Like a couple of them expressed the sentiment that they didn't enjoy being a vampire. But all in all, there was a severe lack of empathy for any of their actions and murder. Take in mind, however, that there isn't a log of times that I'm aware of that we spoke to them. There's the one in captivity that I met in person. There's typed logs of another conducted interview that was taken in 2000. It was in Spanish, but we don't know who was logging the dialogue in. But it was apparently when the DoD initially discovered their existence. The most telling one is the conversation from the family in the 70s. That was recorded by an informant and a whole story on why he was there, but it wasn't vampires at first. I'll tell you all in the next post, but just to bring up my point. All vampires seem like dicks who lack empathy. The one who had the most regret was the father figure of the family, and he scalped Indians for a living before he was turned, so that tells you something. 2 individuals seem to express enjoyment at causing violence, and they have also committed a lot of crimes like rape and robbery. The one we had in custody also had drugs, a firearm, and a scale for weighing drugs in his possession. Look, I'm all for coexisting. Would really prefer a way to reverse the condition. But from what I've seen, I think it's better if individuals like that are left dead.
You're on the right path, and any notable research will show the same. The organ tumor is in fact the new brain. It seems to control the host during feeding killing, but allows a high degree of autonomy while at rest. No, there isn't a vampire hierarchy of elders and such like in the movies, but there are certainly what would be thought of as covens. Weapons, the best we've come up with, are nanomachines, originally designed for another project at MIT, but instead tuned to attach to occult energies, move, and then reshape the atoms. This allows us to destroy the brain. Then we dismember and burn the body. Killing the brain will not kill the vampire. You must destroy the entire thing.
I don't know if you're serious or not. I'll go ahead and ask, since I myself am still curious to this day. What do you mean by occult energies? When we were studying them, we didn't seem to record or measure any discernible form of energy, aside from the sudden heat and pressure their flesh produced when exposed to the sun. Also, upon removal of the heart-brain, the body seemed to die. It has already been decapitated and the limbs dismembered, though. But body functions and cardiovascular activity legit continued, and we noticed that it still continued to heal and was displaying movement, as limited as it could move after having its head and all 4 limbs removed. Once the heart was extracted, the regeneration seemed to stop completely. With how fast it seemed to have been regenerating its limbs, we estimated that within maybe 3 to 4 days, maybe less, it would have been fully healed. They heal remarkably fast. One of the people on our team said she honestly believes they are supernatural, as in spiritual, like magic. They defy almost all logic in how their bodies function. We didn't think up any weapons, really, but we brainstormed a couple of ideas. I honestly believe the best way to combat vampires is by going after them during the daytime hours. During this time, they are asleep. This deep stasis-like sleep doesn't seem to be involuntary, like they can choose to remain awake if necessary, but if given the option, they will choose to sleep. It's like they're compelled to sleep, for lack of a better term. While they are asleep, their bodily functions slow down, with some functions such as respiratory seemingly shutting down entirely, and it takes a lot of external stimuli to get them to wake up. In this state, you could easily walk up to them, even yell down at them and not even get them to stir. While asleep, their bodies aren't modified on will like they can be while they're awake. We destroy the hearts while sleeping or expose them to sunlight. Simple as that. Awake, they are far too strong and the casualties will not be worth it. But that's in the event that they become a threat. Of course, I'll be real. With how few they seem to be in number, along with having no form of organization, they aren't a threat on any national level.
Okay, so currently I really suspect that a man that lives in my street 2 blocks away is an actual vampire. I started living in this city, which is localized close to Germany, about 3 to 4 years ago. I moved in when there were just a few houses, but that guy already had the house of his for a time. Anyway, here are some stories to share. 1. Late night playing video with friend. My room has a big window, but the curtains were closed at time, only a small gap. See someone walking outside at the other side of the road, noticed by the lamp shadow casted by the road lamplight. My face when the guy is carrying a carcass of a deer on his shoulder like it is nothing. Talk to friend about it, go to sleep and keep thinking about the scene until I fall asleep. 2. The guy doesn't appear when the sun is up. Rarely when he does, he is wearing clothes all over the body and carrying an umbrella. Decide to exit the house and greet him. Pale skin, does not speak much, voice is surly but in a good way, seems polite with a vast vocabulary. I decided to talk about the deer seen the other night. Man suddenly walks away, leaving me hanging in the street. I go home, wait until dawn, can't sleep. 3. 2 weeks later sees the same scene with the carcass, but that time watching TV late at night. It's day, decide to ask the few neighbors that time if the man has a family. They say no. Have a smart idea, put a head of garlic inside my pocket at all time. One day sees him walking the street at dawn. Going to greet him. He stays 2 meters away from me at all time, even when I try to get closer. Small chit-chat, go back to home, he continues walking the street. 4. One day hiking near a forest that is close to my friend from the video time, I saw a deer laying down. Broken roof, bites on top of the ass. I know what that is. .jpg. Tell my friend that we should go back to my house. Tell my friend about the man. Friend tells me that he is probably a hunter or SMT. Web him.
Find a way to invite him to dinner without actually inviting him, then serve him garlic. Be sure there are crosses all over the walls. Finally stab him through the heart with a stake. If he dies, he was a vampire. The cops will understand. On a side note, I think we should take OP's thread as an opportunity to discuss the origins of vampires. Where did the myth originate? When was the first tale or report? What were some of the qualities of a vampire, and how did these aspects change over time? The origin of the word vampire, the equivalent of vampires in other folklore. What the plausible as X gets, real-life explanation is for these phenomena. Origin of the myth. seems to be Eastern Europe. Vampiric entities have been recorded in cultures around the world. The term vampire was popularized in Western Europe after reports of an 18th century mass hysteria of a pre-existing folk belief in the Balkans and Eastern Europe that in some cases resulted in corpses being staked and people being accused of vampirism. Local variants in Eastern Europe were also known by different names, such as Striga in Albania, Vrikolakas in Greece, and Strigoi in Romania, although other cultures too. The notion of vampirism has existed for millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, Manipuri, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits which are considered precursors to modern vampires. Despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in these ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively from early 18th century southeastern Europe, when verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and published. In most cases, vampires are revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches, but they can also be created by a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse or by being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends became so pervasive that in some areas it caused mass hysteria and even public executions of people believed to be vampires.
1800s. Family traveling. They need a place to sleep. They go to an inn. They are too broke to afford a room, but the inn owner is generous enough to let them sleep in a shack that's near the inn. However, they are storing a dead body that's to be buried later in there. The family was reluctant to agree, but they have nowhere else to sleep. After all, it's just a dead body, so they decide to not be cowards. Upon arriving, they are relieved to see that the body is laid out behind white drapes so they don't have to see it. They settle down and they eventually go to sleep. Daughter can't sleep, swears she sees the body move a few times throughout the night, thinks she's going mad. Tells herself all logical explanations to avoid the thought that it might be undead. A few hours later, she sees the silhouette of the body rising behind the drapes. It's haggish in appearance and has long pointy nails. Too scared to move, she watches it emerge from the curtains. It kills each of her family members with its long nails. When it gets to her, she jumps up and bolts out the wooden door, running as fast as she can. It chases right behind her. It's right on her tail, arms extended, trying to grab her. It lunges at her with its sharp nails but misses and gets them stuck in a tree. She runs back to the inn while it tries to free itself. Next day, they find the body with its claws still stuck in the tree. The corpse is fried by the sun. Turns out it was the body of some occult witch.
I live in Arkansas. Here's a story I heard from my great-grandpa. Around 1910, 1920. Shit town is just getting settled. Probably around 50, 60 people spread around 10 miles. Grandpa is 10 and has a huge family because Irish. All of the kids sleep in the same room. One day his little sister wakes him up at like midnight and tells him there's a rabbit looking through the window at her. He goes and looks. It's a white rabbit. It just sits completely still outside and watches little sister. Think nothing of it. Rabbit keeps showing up at night. All it does is stare through the window at little sis. She's starting to get weaker and is getting sick more often. Granddaddy finally gets the shotgun, waits for the rabbit to show up, and shoots it. It loses a paw and somehow gets away. Here's the screwed up part, though. They have a neighbor who lives higher up the ridge, fairly close given population density. An old witchy widow who only comes down to get groceries. Nobody in town cares much about her. Anyway, the day after this happens, the family sees the doctor heading up the road to the old woman's house. Great-great-grandma asks what happens because that's a rural thing. The doctor says the old woman had some kind of shit sent down about having a hunting accident. Shot off her hand. Granddaddy's face went.
The human race should weaponize vampires. They seem to be very strong. We can equip them with some type of full-body suit for protection from the sun's rays. Have some kind of armored reinforcement over the chest area to protect their hearts. Anytime we need more soldiers, we just find a good human candidate and inject them with the vampire blood. We could tell the vampires that we can pardon them for their crimes and not hunt them down if they agree to do this. Am I the only one that sees the potential to make a super soldier army? If aliens came down and decided to attack us, we might have a chance if we have an army of super strong, immortal vampires.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.